This move, 1. d4, immediately stakes a claim in the center, controlling key squares and preparing to develop pieces efficiently, setting the stage for a variety of strategic pawn structures and potential tactical skirmishes. By mirroring white's central pawn advance with 1. d5, black immediately stakes a claim in the center, directly challenging white's pawn and establishing symmetry, which can lead to solid but sometimes less dynamic positions. This move initiates the queen's gambit, a fundamental opening where white challenges black's central pawn immediately, aiming to gain space and control of the center. This move, 2. e6, signals the player's intention to enter the queen's gambit declined, a solid and strategically rich opening where black aims for a robust pawn structure and harmonious piece development, often preparing to challenge white's central control. This move develops a knight to its most natural square, reinforcing control of the central e4 square and preparing for further central expansion or king-side development, aiming to build a solid position within the queen's gambit declined framework. This move, knight to f6, is a fundamental developing move in many queen's pawn openings, preparing to castle and controlling central squares while creating a flexible pawn structure for black. This move, bg5, pins the black knight, a common tactic in the queen's gambit declined, aiming to exploit the undefended queen if the knight is forced to move. This move develops the knight to a natural square, supporting the central pawn on d5 and preparing for potential pawn pushes like c6 or e5, while avoiding the immediate pin on the f6 knight. This move solidifies the center and prepares to develop the kingside bishop to a more active square, like d3, aiming for a robust queen's gambit declined structure while maintaining flexibility for white's development. This move signals a transition into a queen's gambit declined terrace defense structure, aiming to solidify the pawn chain and prepare for central pawn breaks with c5. This natural developing move prepares to castle kingside and supports the e4 pawn advance, common in queen's gambit declined structures. This move, 6. ca5, is a common response in the queen's gambit declined terrace defense, aiming to immediately challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially target the c4 pawn. Developing the knight to d2 prepares to reinforce the e4 square and supports a potential e4 pawn push, while also offering flexibility for further piece development. This move, bb4, develops a piece and challenges white's knight on c3, potentially disrupting white's coordination and preparing for central action. White reinforces the central pawn structure and prepares to castle kingside while eyeing black's queen on a5, potentially disrupting black's coordination. By capturing the pawn, black initiates a common queen's gambit declined exchange variation sequence, aiming to clarify the pawn structure and potentially develop pieces more freely. This move resolves white's central tension by eliminating black's knight, which was supporting the c4 pawn, and creating a doubled pawn structure for black in the process, thereby weakening their pawn structure. This recapture maintains black's central pawn presence after white's exchange sacrifice and prepares to develop the kingside pieces. This move recaptures a pawn, centralizes the knight, and prepares to challenge black's active queen by potentially creating a discovered attack or fork. On the a5-d8 diagonal, the queen repositions to c7, preparing to recapture on c4 with the knight and simultaneously aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure. This move is a prophylaxis, aiming to prevent black from playing b-flat 4 c5 or b-flat 4 a5. which would put pressure on white's queenside pawns and potentially disrupt white's development plans. This move develops the bishop to its most natural square, preparing to castle kingside and connect the rooks, a standard developing maneuver in this queen's gambit decline structure. This move prepares to castle kingside, solidifying the king's safety while aiming to develop the g2 bishop to a more active role on the h1a8 diagonal. With the center fluid and white having played a somewhat passive setup, castling kingside secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks for future activity. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to challenge black's central control and potentially aid in a kingside attack or expansion. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, potentially eyeing the queenside and preparing to reinforce the center with the subsequent move c5. This move initiates a pawn lever on the queenside, aiming to gain space and disrupt black's queenside structure, while also preparing to support a further queenside expansion or potentially create an outpost for a knight. This move aims to reinforce the queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances, like circa 5, creating a solid defensive setup against white's central majority and kingside pressure. This move completes king's side development, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks for potential action on the kingside or in the center. This move aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and create counterplay by opening lines, though it concedes central space. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, challenging black's central pawn structure and preparing for potential central breakthroughs or knight outposts. This move challenges white's knight and aims to open the a-file, potentially creating attacking chances on the queenside by leveraging the newly acquired space and an open pathway for the rook. This pawn capture opens the a-file, creating potential for future pressure and a dynamic imbalance on the queenside. This move, capturing the rook on a1, opens the a-file for black's remaining rook and potentially creates tactical threats against white's queenside pawn structure, forcing white to carefully defend or address the increased activity. This move recaptures the rook, regaining material equality and opening the a-file for potential future pressure. Black reinforces the c-file and prepares to contest it with white's rook, aiming to activate its own rook. This exchange simplifies the position, removes black's potentially active knight on d7, and opens the a-file for white's rook, which can now exert pressure on black's queenside pawn structure. This move recaptures the pawn and repositions the queen to a more active square, centralizing it and preparing to contest the d-file. This knight maneuver aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting weaknesses on the queenside or preparing for a central pawn break. This move tactically retreats the queen from the discovered attack threat on the d-file after white's knight captures on d7, while also preparing to potentially challenge the weakened light squares on white's queenside and reconnecting the rooks. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting a central pawn advance or preparing to contest the d-file, while also defending against any immediate threats on the queenside. This move centralizes the knight to a strong outpost, aiming to control key squares and potentially disrupt white's coordination. This pawn thrust seeks to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain space on the queenside, potentially opening lines for white's rook and knight. This move opens the c-file, which will become a critical line of play for both sides, and also leads to a pawn structure where white has a central pawn majority. White captures the pawn on b5, gaining a central pawn majority and an open queenside file which will be important for future play. This move is a strategic repositioning of the rook to an active file, aiming to contest white's control of the central dark squares and potentially create counterplay along the queenside files. The move 24. RC1 actively challenges black's rook on the now open C file, forcing a decision and preparing to exploit the potential weaknesses in black's queenside pawn structure. The rook swings to the queenside to contest the now open A file and prepare to support potential pawn breaks or defend against white's queenside expansion. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, indirectly pressuring black's pawn structure while preparing for potential pawn advances on the queenside and reinforcing the central control of the D file. This move develops the bishop to an active square, targeting white's queen and potentially disrupting their coordination on the queenside, while also preparing to contest the crucial A file. White retreats the rook to b1 to defend the pawn on b2 and prepare to potentially support a central pawn push or contest the b file. This move reroutes the bishop to a more active square, supporting the knight on d5 and potentially preparing to challenge white's control of the long, dark squared diagonal. This move strategically removes black's active bishop, simplifying the position and weakening the dark squares around black's king, which can be exploited later. Black recaptures the pawn, opening the D file and creating a connected passed pawn on d5 which will be a primary target for white. This move is a tactical blunder, sacrificing material for no compensation and allowing black to consolidate their position with increased activity. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, supporting the pawn on d5 and preparing to challenge white's control of the central files. The move qb7 threatens to win material by attacking the weak pawn on b6 and also prepares to bring the queen into an aggressive central role. This pawn move creates space for the king on the kingside, potentially preparing for future pawn breaks or offering a defensive sanctuary as black's pieces consolidate their central presence. This move re-centers the knight, preparing to attack the d6 pawn and potentially create pressure on black's queenside pawn structure. This move aims to centralize the rook and prepare to support the knight's advance while potentially challenging white's central pawn control in the open D file. This move repositions the queen to a more active square on the queenside, aiming to pressure black's central pawns and potentially support a kingside attack or a breakthrough with the B pawn. This move challenges white's rook on the C file, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and potentially create counterplay against white's kingside. This move centralizes the knight, preparing to recapture the pawn on c7 and aiming to exploit white's weakened queenside pawn structure. This move centralizes the queen to eye the kingside and potentially prepare for future pawn advances or support an attack. This king move prepares to activate the king on the kingside after the recent pawn exchanges, potentially supporting a future g4 push or securing the king from any sudden queen incursions. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control central squares and prepare for potential pawn pushes or piece activity on the kingside. The rook actively repositions to the second rank, preparing to exert pressure along the second file and potentially support a pawn push or further infiltration. This move prepares to exploit the weak squares on the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn on the C file by utilizing the open B file. This move repositions the knight to the D3 square, aiming to control key central squares and potentially support a pawn push on the kingside or reinforce the defense of the kingside pawns. This move prepares to undermine white's central control by eventually challenging the D pawn and creating a more dynamic pawn structure. This move prepares to activate the rook on the 6th rank, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses on the queenside or create pressure against black's king. The bishop returns to f8 to defend the critical light squares and regroup, aiming to support the g6 pawn push, which aims to weaken white's kingside control. This rook lift to the 6th rank aims to reposition the rook to a more active square, potentially supporting an attack on the queenside or defending critical central squares, while also preparing to contest the c-file. This move aims to defend the undefended rook on c7 and contest the active c-file, preventing white's pieces from further penetrating black's position. This move simplifies the position by exchanging rooks, aiming to reach a pawn endgame where white's queenside majority is more active. This move recaptures the pawn and maintains the tension in the center, as the queen now attacks white's knight on c3 and influences the d4 square. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control key central squares and potentially target weak pawns or squares on the kingside. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal after the exchange of queens, aiming to participate in the defense of the kingside and potentially control the c7 square. This move forces the black king to a less secure square, allowing white to coordinate their pieces more effectively for an attack on the kingside. The king retreats to a safer square, away from the immediate threat of the queen's check and preparing to potentially defend the weakened kingside pawns. This knight maneuver reroutes the piece to a more active central square, aiming to support the kingside advance and potentially participate in threats against black's weakened king position. The bishop retreats to a safe square, maintaining the defensive potential of the king's side while preparing to support a pawn advance or regroup to a more active diagonal. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, directly eyeing the f6 pawn and potentially preparing to infiltrate on the kingside or support further pawn advances. The black king repositions to g7, seeking a safer haven on the back rank and preparing for potential endgame scenarios where centralizing the king is often advantageous. This move aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, potentially preparing to support an advance on the kingside or consolidate the queenside pawn structure. The queen returns to a more active central square, potentially eyeing pawn breaks or preparing to join the kingside attack if opportunity arises. This move finally opens up the center for white's king and central pawns, aiming to activate the e4 pawn for an attack and potentially gain space and control. The queen repositions to a more active square, preparing to contest the central open file and potentially support a kingside advance or control key squares. This move reinforces the kingside pawn structure, preventing any potential backdoor threats from black's knight or bishop and securing king safety, while preparing for potential further queenside advances or a kingside pawn push. The move 45, qc7, is a sensible repositioning of the queen to better defend the pawn on c7, which is currently the only pawn protecting the king's side from potential advances by white's remaining pieces. This pawn push seeks to open lines for the queen and rook by creating an advanced passed pawn, potentially leading to an attack on the black king. This pawn move opens the central e-file, aiming to activate the queen and potentially create threats on the kingside, though it also weakens the king's pawn shield. This move opens the e-file, creating attacking possibilities against black's king and potentially exploiting the open lines that result from the pawn exchange. This move looks to contest the open c-file and create counterplay against white's queenside pawns, aiming to activate black's pieces and potentially challenge white's central control. This move initiates an endgame where white aims to exploit their slightly more active king and pawn majority on the kingside, while black must carefully defend their remaining pawns. This move simplifies into an endgame where white's passed pawn on d5 is a significant advantage, aiming to promote it by controlling key squares. This move prepares to activate the king by bringing it to a more central position on the board, aiming to utilize it in the endgame for pawn support and potentially attacking the opponent's remaining pawns. With the queens exchanged, black's king now becomes more active, heading towards the center to participate in the endgame skirmishes. The king moves to the center to participate in the endgame, aiming to support the pawns and potentially attack the opponent's pieces. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to contest white's control of the central dark squares and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. This knight maneuver aims to improve its position by repositioning to a more active square, potentially targeting weak pawns or supporting a central advance in the endgame. The bishop retreats to c5 to maintain control of the central diagonal and prepare for potential piece exchanges while protecting the remaining pawns. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to exploit weaknesses in black's pawn structure and potentially launch an attack on the kingside. The king now actively participates in the endgame by seeking central space and potential shelter, while simultaneously pressuring white's isolated pawn structure. The king is repositioning to a more central and active square, preparing to support the advanced d-pawn and potentially join the attack on black's queenside structure. The king retreats to f6 to avoid being trapped on the open diagonal after the knight moves, preparing to support the central pawns and coordinate with the remaining pieces for potential counterplay. This aggressive pawn push aims to dislodge black's knight from the strong g4 square, potentially opening lines for white's king and creating weaknesses in black's pawn structure. This pawn sacrifice, 54, hxg4+, opens lines for the bishop and potentially the king to become more active in the endgame. This pawn capture opens the h-file, creating immediate attacking potential for white's rook on the enemy king and forcing black to defend cautiously. This move brings the king closer to the center, a standard endgame principle to activate the monarch and support the pawn majority on the kingside. This move aims to restrict black's knight, forcing it to retreat and allowing white to consolidate their pawn structure and prepare for a kingside attack. With the enemy knight poised to attack on e5, the bishop repositions to d4, aiming to defend the knight on c6 while indirectly pressuring white's central pawn structure and potentially supporting a future pawn advance. This move, nxf7+, is a decisive tactical blow that wins material by forking the king and the rook on f7, forcing black to address the immediate threat to their king. The knight's recapture on f7 aims to exploit the exposed king, creating a powerful initiative through potential discovered attacks and threats to the pawn structure. The knight repositions to a more active square, aiming to control key central squares and potentially support a pawn advance or exploit weaknesses. On the kingside, the bishop retreats to b6 to defend the weak pawn on d6 and prepare for potential counterplay on the queenside, while white's knight will now attempt to penetrate further into black's position. This move, nc6, activates the knight to a central outpost, defending the pawn on b6 and preparing to attack black's isolated d5 pawn while also potentially limiting the mobility of black's bishop on c5. The bishop retreats to c5, reinforcing the pawn on d6 and maintaining the bishop pair. while white prepares to potentially activate the knight further or exchange pieces. The king's active positioning is crucial now, aiming to support the passed pawn and control key squares in the center and on the queenside. Capturing the knight on f2 is a tactic aimed at disrupting white's coordination and potentially creating counterplay, but it allows white to recover the pawn with a strong initiative. This aggressive pawn push aims to drive the black king into a more exposed position, potentially creating weaknesses for a mating attack or decisive material gain. The king must escape the dangerous checks and seek safety behind the remaining pawns, which is a crucial defensive maneuver in this endgame. This timely knight check forces the black king to move again, allowing white to continue coordinating their forces and restricting black's king's escape routes. The king advances to e7, seeking a safer square on the board as white's knight continues to exert pressure and control key squares. This pawn check forces black's king to move, allowing white to consolidate material advantage by recapturing the advanced pawn and continuing the attack on the exposed king. 63. Kate6 is a desperate attempt by the black king to escape the immediate mating net by heading towards the center, but white's coordinated pieces, particularly the knight and king, are poised to deliver a decisive checkmate. This move aims to centralize the king, preparing to support the advanced pawns and potentially create a passed pawn on the kingside while remaining active in the endgame. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, aiming to contest the kingside if white's king remains exposed. This move initiates a potential king hunt by reinforcing the knight's central presence and preparing to exploit any weaknesses on the kingside. This move retreats the king to a safer square, preparing to regroup and potentially support the remaining minor pieces for defense and counterplay against white's advancing king. The king's active centralizing maneuver now secures the f4 square, preparing to escort the passed pawn and create potential mating threats with the knight. This move aims to protect the weak pawn on d6 by bringing the bishop back to a more defensive square, although it allows white's knight to potentially advance further into black's territory. This move forces the black king into a more exposed position, aiming to exploit the open diagonal with the white queen and potentially create a mating net or win material. The king must flee the advancing pawn and the looming discovered attack from white's knight. This move creates a passed pawn that can advance towards the promotion square, forcing black to commit defensive resources. This move re-centers the bishop to a more active square, eyeing potential exchanges and preparing to support the king's defense or a future pawn advance in the endgame. The king advances to d5 to centralize and prepare to support the passed pawn on d6, aiming to create decisive attacking chances. The rook on e1 is now supported by the king and poised to advance on the g-file, aiming to create a passed pawn or launch a kingside attack, while black seeks to consolidate and prevent white's pawns from advancing further. This pawn push, d7+, is a decisive check that forces the black king into a mating net, a direct consequence of white's superior piece activity and pawn structure.